Bernard Holloway sat high on his bench, wearing his arrogance like a crown, while Jonathan Graves sat low in his wheelchair, wearing his silence like a weapon. One believed he was untouchable, the other knew the truth. In a courtroom built on power and fear, neither man was who they appeared to be, but by the end of the day, only one would walk out on his own terms. The grand courtroom buzzed with quiet conversations as people settled into their seats, waiting for the next case to begin. Lawyers shuffled through their papers, court officers stood at attention, and spectators whispered to one another, eager for the latest drama. The air smelled of old wood and polished leather, a space designed to command respect. At the center of it all sat Judge Bernard Holloway, an imposing figure draped in black robes. His reputation preceded him, brilliant in legal matters, but infamous for his arrogance and cruelty. He didn't just preside over cases, he made a spectacle of them. Today, the defendant was unlike the usual criminals brought before the court. A frail man in a wheelchair sat quietly near the defense table. His clothes were old and worn, his posture slightly slumped as if carrying a heavy burden. His hands trembled, whether from illness or nerves, no one could tell. His thinning hair framed a gaunt face, and his sunken eyes stared at the floor, unreadable. The crime he was accused of was minor, trespassing in an abandoned building. But to Judge Holloway, that didn't matter. The courtroom wasn't about justice for him, it was about power. The moment the judge laid eyes on the defendant, a smirk tugged at the corner of his lips. He saw weakness, vulnerability, a perfect target. His voice boomed as he addressed the court, laced with the false politeness he often used when ridiculing someone. The spectators leaned forward, sensing what was coming. They had seen it before. He loved to make an example of those who couldn't fight back. His remarks started with mock concern. He questioned whether the man even understood why he was there, speaking slowly, as if addressing a child. He made exaggerated gestures, pretending to search for sympathy that was never going to come. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Encouraged, Holloway pushed further. He speculated whether the man had gotten lost on his way to a charity drive. He joked about whether he was part of a street magician's act, pretending to be crippled to gain pity. Laughter erupted across the room. Lawyers smirked behind their hands, court officers exchanged glances, and even some members of the jury struggled to hide their amusement. The man in the wheelchair, however, remained silent. He neither flinched nor reacted. He simply sat there, absorbing every word without a change in expression. That silence unsettled Holloway, though he didn't show it. He was used to watching people squirm under his words, seeing them stammer, plead, or react in outrage. This man did none of those things. He didn't argue, didn't beg for mercy, didn't even attempt to explain himself. That lack of response made Holloway push harder. The insults became crueler. He exaggerated the details of the case, making it seem as though the defendant had trespassed into a luxury estate rather than a rundown, abandoned building. He mocked the idea that a man in such a condition could even manage to break the law properly. Every word dripped with condescension, designed to strip away whatever dignity the man had left. Still, the man didn't react. His eyes remained locked on the judge, quiet and unreadable. For a moment, Holloway faltered. He felt something shift in the room, an invisible weight pressing against him. It was almost imperceptible, but it was there, an unsettling stillness. He quickly dismissed it. He had humiliated hundreds of defendants before, and this was no different. The man's silence was nothing more than shock or fear. Satisfied that he had made his point, Holloway leaned back in his chair, ready to move on. He asked the prosecutor for the recommended sentence, already prepared to impose the harshest penalty possible. The courtroom awaited the final verdict, the mood still charged with amusement. But beneath the surface, something else was brewing, something no one had anticipated. And though no one realized it yet, this was not just another routine trial. This case was about to change everything. Judge Bernard Holloway carried himself like a man untouchable by the world around him. In the courtroom, he was a force of nature, cold, commanding, and confident. He had spent years molding his reputation, ensuring that his word was law, both in the judicial system and beyond. Few dared to challenge him, and those who did quickly learned that he had ways of making problems disappear. Power had become his closest companion, and he wielded it with precision, ensuring that no one ever questioned his authority. But behind the polished wood of his bench, behind the expensive suits and practiced smirks, Holloway carried secrets. They were buried deep, hidden beneath layers of carefully constructed lies, yet always lingering just out of sight. He had long since convinced himself that those secrets would never surface, that his past would remain locked away where it belonged. After all, time had a way of erasing things, or so he thought. Years ago, before he had fully secured his position as one of the most respected judges in the city, there had been a case that had threatened everything he had built. A case that, if handled incorrectly, could have exposed him for what he truly was. It had involved a man named Jonathan Graves, a wealthy businessman with connections to powerful figures. Graves had been accused of orchestrating an elaborate financial fraud scheme, embezzling millions from investors who had trusted him. The evidence had been overwhelming, the trial a media sensation. Graves had played the system for years, moving money through shadowy channels, but his luck had finally run out. Or so it seemed. Holloway had presided over the case, and from the very beginning he had known how it would end. Not because the law dictated it, but because he had made certain of it. Behind closed doors, away from cameras and journalists, a deal had been struck. Graves had something that Holloway wanted: leverage, power, and the ability to make problems go away. In exchange for a favorable ruling, Holloway had ensured that the right people would look the other way on certain matters. It was a simple trade, one he had made more times than he cared to count. And just like that, justice was bent to suit those who could afford it. But then, something had gone wrong. Before the final ruling could be delivered, Graves had disappeared, vanished without a trace. No one knew where he had gone, not the prosecutors, not the press, not even the people who had trusted him most. His properties were abandoned, his bank accounts wiped clean. Some speculated that he had fled overseas, escaping into a life of luxury beyond the reach of the law. Others believed something far more sinister had taken place. The whispers never stopped, murmurs of men in dark suits, of quiet threats made in the dead of night. Holloway had pretended not to care. He had moved on, allowing time to bury the scandal. With Graves gone, there were no more loose ends. Nothing to tie him to the corruption that had nearly unraveled his career. He had continued on, thriving in his position, his confidence growing with every year that passed. The memory of Graves had faded, reduced to nothing more than a footnote in the long history of forgotten crimes. But the past had a way of resurfacing when it was least expected. Sitting in his courtroom now, Holloway found himself feeling something he hadn't felt in years: unease. He told himself it was nonsense, that the frail man in the wheelchair before him was nothing more than another insignificant defendant, another case to be disposed of like so many before. And yet, there was something about him, something in the way he sat there, silent and unmoving, that felt disturbingly familiar. The man had made no plea, offered no explanation for his alleged crime. He had simply remained still, absorbing every insult, every joke at his expense, without so much as a flicker of emotion. It was unnatural. It was unsettling. Holloway dismissed the feeling, pushing it away as nothing more than an overactive mind. He was in control. He had always been in control. Whatever ghosts from the past threatened to rise, he would bury them again, like just as he had before, but some things refused to stay buried. The courtroom was still. The laughter had died down, replaced by an uneasy silence that no one could quite explain. The man in the wheelchair had not spoken a word, had not flinched under the weight of Judge Holloway's ridicule, yet something about him had shifted. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but those who paid attention could feel it. The air around him seemed heavier, as if his very presence was pressing against the walls of the room. Holloway, despite his arrogance, sensed it too. He told himself it was nothing, that the frail figure before him was just another unfortunate soul caught in the wheels of justice. But something deep in his subconscious refused to let it go. There was a familiarity to this man, something in the way he held himself, in the way his eyes, dark and steady, locked onto him with an intensity that felt unnatural. It was not the look of a desperate man. It was the look of someone who knew something no one else did. A cold feeling crept up Holloway's spine, and he straightened in his chair, pushing the thought away. He was the judge, the one with the authority, the one with the final word. He would not allow an unremarkable trespasser to unsettle him. With a practiced expression of indifference, he cleared his throat and turned back to the case. The prosecutor had finished listing the charges. It was time to move on, time to deliver the punishment. His gavel was halfway to the desk when the man in the wheelchair finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, he raised his head, locking eyes with the judge in a way that sent an unexpected chill through the room. The weight of the gaze was suffocating, but Holloway refused to look away. He wouldn't be intimidated, not in his own courtroom. Then, without warning, the man placed his hands on the armrests of his wheelchair. It was a simple movement, yet it commanded absolute attention. Every person in the room watched as his fingers tightened, his shoulders straightened, and with an agonizing slowness, he began to push himself up. At first, it looked like a struggle, like the weight of his own body was too much for his weakened limbs. A collective breath caught in the air. Was he about to fall? Was this some last pitiful to stand before sentencing? But then something changed. The hesitation was gone. His body lifted, strong and steady, rising inch by inch until he was fully upright. The room was frozen. The bailiffs, the attorneys, the spectators, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if time itself had stopped to witness what should have been impossible. A man who had seemed frail, helpless, confined to a wheelchair, now stood tall and unwavering before them. The transformation was unsettling, eerie even, and the weight of his presence filled every inch of the courtroom. Holloway's mouth went dry. His fingers twitched as they gripped the gavel tighter. His mind scrambled for an explanation, but none came. The cold feeling in his chest spread, tightening like a fist around his ribs. Then the man smiled. It was the smallest movement, just the barest lift of his lips, but it sent an electric current of fear through Holloway's body. There was something familiar in that expression, something Holloway had not seen in years but could never forget. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the murmurs that had begun to ripple through the crowd. And then, like a key turning in a lock, recognition struck him. His breath caught. His grip on the gavel faltered. The man standing before him, the man who had just defied every expectation in that courtroom, was no stranger at all. It was Jonathan Graves. The realization hit like a physical blow, knocking the air from Holloway's lungs. He felt his face drain of color, his fingers numbing against the polished wood of his desk. No, it wasn't possible. Graves had disappeared. He had been gone for years. There had been no trace of him, no sign that he had ever intended to return. Holloway had made sure of that. Yet here he was. The murmurs in the room grew louder. People were shifting in their seats, exchanging glances, sensing that something beyond their understanding was unfolding before them. They didn't know who this man was, not yet. But they could feel the weight of his presence, the unshakable confidence in the way he stood before the judge who had once sealed his fate. For the first time in his career, Holloway was at a loss for words. His mind spun, trying to piece together how this was happening, how a man he had written off as gone, perhaps even dead, was now standing before him, very much alive and very much in control. The silence stretched, heavy and unrelenting. The world had shifted in that moment, and Holloway knew with a sinking certainty that nothing would ever be the same again. Judge Bernard Holloway sat frozen, his mind racing as the weight of the moment pressed down on him. The courtroom had been his domain, a place where his authority was absolute. But now, in the presence of the man standing before him, that certainty began to crumble. Jonathan Graves was not supposed to be here. He was not supposed to exist in this space, in this moment. The past that Holloway had spent years burying had risen from the grave, and there was nowhere to hide. The spectators sensed the shift in power. The laughter and amusement that had filled the room just minutes ago had vanished, replaced by a thick, suffocating silence. The frail, helpless man in the wheelchair had transformed before their eyes, revealing a presence that no one could ignore. Even those who didn't know his identity could feel the energy radiating from him, a quiet, controlled force that commanded attention without a single word. Holloway's pulse pounded in his ears. He gripped the edge of his desk, willing his hands to stop shaking, but the cold fear settling in his chest refused to loosen its grip. His mind scrambled for an explanation, a way to dismiss what was happening, But the longer he stared at the man before him, the clearer it became. There was no mistake. Jonathan Graves had returned. Graves did not move, did not speak. He only watched. His eyes, sharp and unreadable, locked onto Holloway with an intensity that stripped away every layer of confidence the judge had once worn so easily. It was not the look of a man seeking justice. It was the look of a man who had already won. Holloway felt his throat tighten. He had controlled countless trials, dictated the fate of countless people, but for the first time in his career, he had no control at all. He was the one on trial now, and there was no defense that could save him. The courtroom was still, but the energy in the air was alive, buzzing with tension as people shifted in their seats, waiting for something, anything, to happen. The prosecutor, who had moments ago been prepared to deliver sentencing recommendations, now sat frozen, his mouth slightly open, his prepared statements forgotten. The defense attorney looked equally stunned, his hands gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Then, slowly, deliberately, Graves reached into his jacket and pulled out a stack of papers. The movement was calm, measured, but it sent a ripple of unease through the room. Holloway's stomach twisted. He didn't need to see what was in those papers to know what they contained. Evidence. For years, he had convinced himself that his secrets were safe, that the deals he had made, the power he had abused, the cases he had manipulated would never come to light. But now, standing in his own courtroom, facing the man he had once betrayed, he understood the truth. His past had not disappeared. It had been waiting, watching, biding its time. Graves took a step forward, closing the distance between them. The sound of his footsteps echoed through the silent room. Holloway's breath came shallow and quick. He wanted to speak, to regain control of the situation, but the words refused to come. He glanced at the bailiffs, the court officers, anyone who could put an end to this moment, but no one moved. No one spoke. They were waiting, just like everyone else, for the inevitable. Graves placed the stack of papers on the judge's desk. The documents spread out slightly, revealing official seals, signatures, transcripts, proof of everything Holloway had done. The weight of it was unbearable. For years, Holloway had ruled with an iron grip, believing himself untouchable, above the very law he was sworn to uphold. He had built a life on the foundation of manipulation and deception, convinced that no one could ever challenge him. But now, standing before a man he had long since erased from his conscience, he realized how wrong he had been. The whispers started slowly, rippling through the courtroom like a rising tide. People leaned toward one another, exchanging hurried, hushed words. Reporters scribbled furiously, sensing that they were witnessing something historic. Even those who had admired Holloway could see the cracks forming, the unshakable judge unraveling before their eyes. For the first time in his career, he was not the one delivering judgment. He was the one being judged. The weight of the courtroom pressed down on Judge Bernard Holloway like a suffocating fog. The once commanding figure, who had ruled with arrogance and absolute authority, now sat motionless, his face pale and drained of its usual smug confidence. The stack of papers before him was more than just ink and signatures. It was the sum of every corrupt decision, every backroom deal, every injustice he had orchestrated to serve his own ambition. And now, it was all being laid bare. The whispers in the room grew louder, a restless energy spreading through the spectators. Some leaned forward, trying to catch a glimpse of the documents that had rendered the infamous judge speechless. Others exchanged glances, eyes wide with the realization that they were witnessing the downfall of a man who had once seemed untouchable. The air crackled with tension, thick with the anticipation of something inevitable. Holloway forced himself to breathe. He needed to think, to regain control, but his mind was a tangled mess of panic and denial. This wasn't happening. It couldn't be happening. He had buried the past too deeply, ensured that there was no trail leading back to him. Yet Jonathan Graves stood before him, very much alive, very much in control, and holding the one thing that could destroy him completely. His fingers twitched as he reached for the papers, his movements stiff and unnatural. He scanned the top sheet and his stomach twisted into a knot. The documents were damning. Transcripts of conversations he thought had been erased, financial records proving bribes exchanged under his watch, testimonies from people he had silenced long ago. It was all there, a carefully constructed case against him. He had spent his life sentencing criminals, but now he was the one facing an inescapable verdict. A sharp, knowing fear settled in his chest. Graves had not come for an argument. He had not come to plead for justice. He had come with proof. And Holloway knew what that meant. The courtroom doors creaked open, and a group of uniformed officers stepped inside, their presence sending a shockwave through the spectators. Gasps rippled across the room. Some people turned their heads toward Holloway, watching for his reaction, waiting for the judge who had humiliated so many to face his own reckoning. Holloway's breath came short and quick. He glanced at the officers, his mind screaming at him to do something, to deny, to deflect, to call this a setup. But his voice failed him. The evidence spoke louder than any excuse he could muster. One of the officers, a stern-faced man with sharp eyes, stepped forward and addressed the court. His words were clear, authoritative, final. An arrest warrant had been issued for Bernard Holloway. The charges ranged from obstruction of justice to conspiracy and bribery. He was no longer the one presiding over a case. He was the accused. The room erupted. Some gasped, some whispered in shock, while others nodded, as if they had always suspected the truth but never thought they would see the day when Holloway would fall. The judge sat rigid, his hands clenched into fists on the desk. He wanted to resist, to fight back, but the moment he saw Graves' expression, calm, unwavering, victorious, he knew it was over. There was nothing left to say. The officers moved toward him, and for the first time in his life, Holloway felt powerless. The same gavel he had slammed down on countless defendants now sat useless beside him. The same courtroom where he had dictated fates now bore witness to his own downfall. As cold metal cuffs locked around his wrists, the finality of it all settled over him. He was escorted out of the courtroom, his once commanding stride reduced to a slow, defeated walk. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, cameras flashing as they documented the fall of a man who had ruled without mercy. And as he was led through the doors, the last thing he saw was Jonathan Graves standing tall, watching him go, his expression unreadable. The past had caught up, and justice, at last, had been served.